Let's be clear from the start. Obedience wasn't encouraged in the medieval world, it was required. You didn't ask questions. You didn't speak out. You didn't dare resist unless you liked the idea of being publicly humiliated, or worse. From the lord of the manor to the old priest who never blinked, everyone above you in the food chain had one expectation: immediate compliance. And if they didn't get it, there was always a belt, a staff, or a scripture handy to remind you who held the power. Start with the manor lord. He wasn't just your boss. He owned the ground you walked on, the air you breathed, and technically your ability to stay alive. You didn't pay rent. You didn't sign a lease. You existed on his land like a tolerated shadow, working his fields, bowing your head when he rode by, and offering your harvest whether you had enough to feed your own family or not. If he said jump, you didn't ask how high. You just jumped, because asking would have been seen as defiance, and defiance didn't end well. If you refused, well, then it got interesting. That nice little grain stash you were hiding? Gone. Your dignity? Crushed. And depending on the mood, you might find yourself in the stocks during a snowstorm. Picture this. Wooden planks clamped around your neck and wrists while your neighbors shuffle by with judging eyes and maybe a turnip or two. That's best case scenario. Worst case, rocks. And if you dared to protest the unfairness, congratulations. You just earned yourself another round. But lords weren't your only problem. The church was just as powerful, maybe even more terrifying. God might forgive, but the local priest didn't. He watched everything. Who skipped mass? Who whispered during the homily? Who might be getting a little too friendly with someone else's goat? And he didn't just take notes for spiritual reasons, he stored those details like weapons, pulling them out when leverage was needed. Whisper the wrong thing and suddenly you're not just gossipy, you're blasphemous. Or worse, suspected of witchcraft. Oh, and let's talk about tithing. That wasn't optional either. You owed the church 10% of everything. Not your extra. Not your leftovers. Everything. If you harvested 10 sacks of grain, one went to the priest, whether or not your children were eating weeds for dinner. Miss a tithe? You didn't get a kind reminder. You got a sermon. In front of the whole congregation. With meaningful stares and eternal consequences. And here's the thing. The priest wasn't scary because he was strong. He was scary because he remembered. He knew who skipped prayers. Who rolled their eyes during service. Who questioned why fasting meant eating boiled weeds for 6 straight weeks. And when winter rolled around and everyone's patience was worn thin, it didn't take much for him to single someone out from the pulpit and roast them harder than the Sunday pig. Then there was the law, and I use that word loosely. The village constable was often just another farmer with a stick and a self-appointed sense of justice. Justice wasn't about fairness. It was about maintaining control. Steal a loaf of bread? Lose a hand. Mock a noble? Kiss your tongue goodbye. Gossip too loud? Time to try on the scold's bridle, a twisted metal cage for your head that forced your mouth shut and made you a walking warning sign. Even private behavior came with public consequences. If your kid acted out, that was on you. If your spouse cursed the weather, the punishment got shared. Discipline was communal, and the whipping post didn't care whose fault it was. Someone was going to bleed. And don't think for a second that cleverness would save you. In this world, intelligence was suspicious. Reading was for priests. Curiosity got people drowned. Ask too many questions and suddenly someone starts whispering about sorcery behind your back. Now, if you were a woman, the rules weren't just stricter, they were chains. You obeyed your father, your husband, and then your son. In that order. You didn't speak too loudly. You didn't rest too long. And heaven help you if you showed signs of independence or knowledge. Healing someone with herbs? Which? Speaking out in public? Which? Knowing what a constellation was? Extra firewood for the bonfire. It wasn't about what you did, it was about what they decided your actions meant. Even your neighbors weren't safe. They weren't allies. They were part of the system. That lady who shared her bread with you last week might report you for working on a saint's feast day. That cousin who borrowed your axe might mention you mumbled something in your sleep. Surveillance didn't come in the form of cameras. It came in the form of nosy humans with too much time and not enough trust. And in the cold, where everyone's patience was thin and food was thinner, that paranoia spread like frost across your soul. A missing chicken, a stolen tool, a bad trade, any small disagreement could become the spark for public humiliation or worse. There was no appeal. No second opinion. The best you could hope for was that your Lord had a good breakfast and your priest wasn't still cranky from the last confession. Even laughter was a liability. Joking at the wrong time, in front of the wrong person with the wrong tone, suddenly your sense of humor sounded like sedition. Laughing was only safe when you were laughing at someone in the stocks, or at the priest's joke, or the Lord's horse accidentally tripping. Anything else was suspicious behavior. And winter? It made everything sharper, colder, crueler. Pain hit harder. A slap in summer stung. A slap in winter could split your skin and leave you bleeding onto the frozen ground. There was no balm. No ointment. Just snow, silence, and the sting of punishment layered over the sting of frostbite. There were no village meetings, no, let's hear your side. Orders came from the top. Submission came from the bottom. And if you questioned the rules, if you dared to ask why Father Thomas got extra bread on Fridays while your children were eating soup made from boiled bark, you weren't brave. You were suicidal. And the worst part? Even your thoughts didn't feel safe. You learned to keep them quiet. To smile when your heart wanted to scream. Because even thinking freely felt like an act of rebellion. And rebellion? That didn't survive the winter. The snow swallowed it, froze it, cracked it apart. So you learned the script. You bowed just right. You said yes with your lips and no with your eyes. You taught your children not to dream big but to survive small. Not to be noticed. Not to be clever. Just to be silent. Useful. Obedient. Because that's what kept you alive. Not joy. Not fairness. Not hope. Just obedience. Nighttime in the medieval winter wasn't quiet in a peaceful way, it was quiet like a held breath. The kind of quiet that pressed in on you, heavy, making you listen harder, breathe slower, sleep lighter. The fire crackled softly. The wind whistled through the gaps in the thatch. And sometimes something howled. And that's when you realized you weren't alone. Not in the comforting, someone has your back, way. More like, something is out there and it's hungry. Wolves were the obvious threat. In summer they stayed deep in the woods. But by December they were starving. By January they were bold. They followed chimney smoke, watched from the tree line, crept close to your fences. When you walked alone to fetch water or dump a slop bucket, you could feel them watching. They rarely attacked outright, but everyone had heard the stories, about slipping on the ice, lantern going out, and something cold and fast in the dark. And they weren't the only ones. There were smaller predators, sneakier ones already inside your home. Rats didn't care about the cold. They made themselves cozy under your bed, behind the sacks of barley, inside the walls. They chewed through belts, boots, soap, and if you were unlucky, your last piece of dried meat. You'd hear them at night, the scraping and skittering, the sharp shriek from a neighbor who found a nest in the laundry pile. You had a cat, great. A good mouser in winter was worth more than a child, and they knew it. They'd curl by the fire and give you a look that said, feed me or deal with the rats yourself. But if they got lazy or hungry, they stopped hunting. Then the vermin came back. And so did the chewed corners of bread, the missing sausage, and the droppings in your flour. Even your dogs might turn on you. Some were strays now, abandoned when food ran out. They prowled the village edges in packs, ribs sharp beneath ragged fur, ears torn, eyes yellow. You didn't trust them and they didn't trust you. And when they got desperate, barking turned to biting. Out in the woods there were rumors. People talked about lynxes, quick and quiet. They usually avoided people, but not always. If one showed up in the village, it wasn't considered strange, just unlucky. Then there were boars. Not hunters but chargers. Big, stupid, angry. If you cornered one or if it smelled food, it came at you like a battering ram. People tried hunting them during the leanest months. Sometimes they came back with meat. Sometimes they didn't come back at all. But let's not forget the inside of the house wasn't much safer than the woods. The cold drove in more than wolves and rats. Spiders, centipedes, beetles, things that crawled and crunched underfoot, they all wanted in. You stepped on them barefoot and pretended not to scream. You swept them into the fire and stirred your soup like nothing happened. Food storage was a battlefield. If you were lucky enough to have meat or dried apples or fish, you guarded it like gold. Because you weren't the only one after it. Mice never slept. Mold spread like gossip. And your family dog started eyeing the larder door like it was hiding miracles. You hung food from the rafters, but even that didn't always work. One morning you'd find half a sausage missing and claw marks in the wood. Even birds got weird. The crows were the worst, black eyes watching from rooftops, fence posts, branches. They followed you. 3 of them perched above your door? That was a bad sign. People didn't talk about what it meant. They just crossed themselves and threw salt at the threshold. In winter everything watched. And you learned to watch back. You checked the snow every morning, not out of curiosity but survival. Footprints across your path meant something had been there. Maybe just a fox. Maybe not. You'd shovel away the tracks, not just to clear the way but to erase your scent. Hide your presence. Make your home look like there was nothing worth taking. Some folks hung charms above their doors, bundles of twigs, carved bones, dried herbs. Protection, they said. Against wolves. Against spirits. Against bad luck. Did they work? Who knew? But nobody dared take them down. The language of winter wasn't made of words. It was made of signs. Snow drifted in strange ways, tree branches cracking without wind, a sudden silence that meant something was nearby. You started to hear differently, see differently. You noticed when the forest grew too quiet, when the fire popped in the wrong rhythm, when the wind changed direction mid-howl. Sleep became something else entirely. You didn't sink into it. You hovered at the edge. You kept a knife nearby, dull and rusted but close. Every creak, every gust of wind, every tap against the wall became a question. Is it just the house settling? Or is something, or someone, trying to get in? Predators didn't knock. They didn't announce themselves. They came silently with sharp teeth and cold eyes. And the church, for all its talk of protection, didn't patrol your chicken coop. God might be watching, but he wasn't chasing rats out of your cellar or stopping the frost from creeping through the cracks in your walls. So you learned. You tied the door shut twice. You kept the fire burning low, just enough to keep the chill at bay but not enough to attract attention. And you prayed, not for joy, not even for warmth. Just to stay alive through the night. You counted food in days. You tucked your hands under your arms not for comfort, but because frostbite didn't ask permission. You walked fast, spoke little, listened always. Because in a world where rebellion freezes and mercy sleeps, staying alive was the only form of success. Every breath was a small defiance. Every night survived was a miracle. And still things could get worse. When the food ran out and the roof leaked and the cold never left your bones, there was still one place left to turn. God? Or more precisely the medieval church. But let's be honest, faith in this world wasn't always comfort. Sometimes, it felt like just another mouth demanding something you didn't have. Religion in the Middle Ages wasn't a personal choice. It wasn't about inspiration or quiet reflection. It was everywhere, woven into the rhythm of life like breath and frost. Especially in winter, when death crept closer and the night stretched too long, belief became a necessity. But this wasn't faith the way we imagine it now. This was rigid, punishing obedience. You didn't just believe in God, you built your entire life around his gaze. And you assumed most of the time he wasn't pleased. The church offered rules. Lots of them. You went to Mass even if it meant crossing a frozen river or dragging your feverish child through the snow. You confessed sins even when you weren't sure what counted as a sin anymore. You fasted when told, prayed when expected, and listened when the priest told you that suffering was holy. And you did it all while freezing to death in a stone church that felt more like a crypt than a sanctuary. Dirt floors. Stone walls. A wind that found every gap in the mortar and went straight for your spine. You sat still, teeth chattering, while the priest, warm in layers of wool and authority, chanted Latin none of you understood. But you nodded anyway because understanding wasn't the point. Obedience was. Missing Mass? That wasn't just a personal choice. It was a public failing. The priest noticed. The neighbors noticed. That one old woman in the front pew, the one who never blinked, she definitely noticed. And you'd better believe someone would mention it come next Sunday. Then there were the tithes. The church took 10% of everything, not 10% of your extra, your surplus. 10% of all you had. Grain, eggs, chickens, the last goat that still gave milk. Even when your kids were living on stringy boiled oats and the turnip broth was thinner than your boot soles, God still needed his cut. Apparently, heaven had operating expenses. Religion in winter wasn't about hope. It was survival theater. People prayed for everything: warmth, food, health, sanity. The strength to not strangle your in-laws after 3 months snowed in. You turned to saints like they were emergency contacts. St. Cal? St. Eligius. Frozen fingers? St. Polycarp, probably. Lost your axe in the river? St. Anthony. Losing your mind from trying to survive January? St. Dymphna, patron of those hanging on by a thread. Relics were another form of hope. People trudged for miles through snow and slush to kiss the finger bone of a saint or touch a rag that once wiped a holy man's nose. They whispered prayers to glass boxes full of teeth, not because they really understood the theology but because they were out of options. Maybe the bones worked, maybe they didn't. But when your baby was burning with fever or your crops had frozen solid, you kissed whatever bones you could find. And still, sometimes nothing changed. No healing. No relief. And then the guilt crept in. Maybe you didn't pray hard enough. Maybe you had a sin you hadn't confessed. Maybe this was punishment. Confession became its own kind of winter ritual. You knelt in a wooden booth, knees aching, voice low, whispering shame into the darkness. The priest didn't flinch. He'd heard it all: envy, theft, blasphemy, eating bacon on a fast day. You walked out a little lighter until the guilt came back 5 minutes later, clinging like the cold. And just when you thought religion couldn't ask more of you, it did. What? Advent. Saint Days. Fasting. No meat. No eggs. Sometimes no dairy, even when your pantry was already full of nothing. Imagine surviving on moldy roots and crusts for 3 weeks and then being told that butter was sinful. So you huddled with your family over a sad little pot of onion water, called it a holy meal, and didn't dare complain. Because questioning the church wasn't just rebellion. It was heresy. And heresy didn't just get you a bad reputation, it could get you burned. The church was more than just sermons and sacraments. It was a power structure. It owned land, collected taxes, set the calendar, and defined morality. It promised that all this pain, all this mud, cold, hunger, and humiliation would be worth it in the next life. And if you slipped up, if you disobeyed or doubted or missed Mass because your child was dying, well, eternal fire was the backup plan. Not poetic fire. Actual fire. Screaming forever fire. That's what awaited you. And the weather itself seemed to support the priest's message. A surprise storm? God's warning. A brief warm spell? God's mercy. A failed harvest? Someone sinned. No one knew who, but someone. So everyone watched everyone else. Whispered suspicions. Pointed fingers. She muttered during Mass. He skipped Vespers. Their kid asked too many questions. The priest didn't live like you did. Sure, he wasn't a noble. But he had wine, a warmer house, maybe even a feather pillow. He reminded you often that suffering brought you closer to God, while sipping something sweet behind his curtain. And still you listened. Because what choice did you have? The church sold one thing better than any other: hope. And in a world where a cough could kill your child and a falling roof could bury your brother, hope was all you had. Heaven was the carrot at the end of the stick. Golden streets, warm light, no frostbite, no hunger, no moldy bread. It didn't have to make sense. It just had to be better than this. You'd carve crosses into the beams above your bed. Tie little saint charms to your belt. Whisper rosaries in the dark. Every tiny act of faith was like a rope tied to your sanity. Not because you were sure it worked, but because you couldn't bear to think it didn't. And when someone died, and someone always died, it was the church that offered a ritual. Not warmth, not shelter, but meaning. Graves had to be hacked open in frozen ground. Or if the earth was too hard, bodies were kept in barns. You prayed they wouldn't attract wolves before spring. The priest would come, swing incense that froze mid-air, and murmur Latin over red fingers and stiff corpses. This was the final sacrament, a farewell in frost and silence. Faith wasn't comfort. It was endurance. It was desperation shaped into discipline. Even when your knees bled from kneeling. Even when your prayers went unanswered. Even when you weren't sure anyone was listening, you prayed. Because in the medieval winter, when everything else had been taken, faith was the last thing left. Spring in the medieval world wasn't exactly the joyful rebirth we tend to imagine. Sure, the snow melted, the birds returned, and the frost finally gave up its grip on the land. But that didn't mean life got better. No, spring was just the beginning of the long, painful recovery from winter's bite. It was a rumor more than a promise. It wasn't the fresh start you'd been hoping for, it was more like a slow crawl out of the grave you nearly slipped into. The fields didn't just miraculously bloom overnight. They were still frozen. The ground hadn't thawed enough to plant anything meaningful. You could walk outside and see a tiny sprout, but it wasn't much. Probably a weed, maybe a blade of grass, but it was enough to stop and look at. It was enough to feel a tiny flicker of hope, even if it was premature. Because survival in the medieval world didn't come from grand victories or easy answers. It came from the small things, the things that made you feel like you might not be swallowed whole by the next winter. But the losses from winter didn't disappear, and neither did the scars it left. Those first days of spring were quiet. People were thinner, quieter, and definitely not celebrating. They were looking at the earth like it owed them something, like if they stared long enough, it might give something back. Food, hope, a reason to keep going. You didn't expect happiness in spring. Not yet. You just wanted less pain, less hunger, the bare minimum. Maybe a new fire in the hearth, maybe a child chasing a chicken, maybe someone playing a sad tune on a broken flute. But the smell of wet earth and budding grass was an improvement over the stench of mildew and death. Spring wasn't about rebirth, it was about survival. It didn't erase the memories of what winter had taken. It didn't fill the gaps where people had disappeared, where families had fallen apart. But it muddied the ground, which was at least a beginning. But it was still dangerous. You still had to learn to plant, to store better, to brace harder. Your toes were still numb from the cold, your hands still cracked from the frost, and your heart still ached for the ones who didn't make it through the winter. You worked the fields, coughing up the tail end of a long illness, still wondering if the same fate was coming for you. Spring was only the promise of recovery, but it wasn't guaranteed. The fields might still be barren, and if the next frost hit too soon, you'd be back in the same position as last year, fighting for survival with empty stomachs and frozen fingers. People didn't talk about what had happened in winter. You didn't need to. The pain was written in the way you moved, the way you spoke, the way you looked at the earth like it could give you back your loved ones. The survivors were marked. The old woman who muttered too loudly in church, the man who had started drinking too much, the widow who now spent all her time in the garden, her eyes far away. Spring didn't fix everything, but it did something else. It buried the pain in new tasks, in more work, and in the quiet hope that the next winter might not be as bad. You didn't talk about the worst of it. It wasn't a conversation anyone wanted to have. You just said, "We made it." You nodded, pretending you weren't still feeling the weight of what had been lost. You fought for survival, not for joy. Because that was all you could do. Survive. The truth was too long to speak aloud. The losses, the grief, the trauma, it was too much for any single person to hold. So instead you just kept moving, working, planting, praying. Spring was quiet, but it was enough to make you keep going. Just a little longer, you told yourself. Just one more season, one more year. Maybe it wouldn't be as bad. Maybe next winter would be kinder. But you knew better. You had seen what hunger could do. You had watched it tear through families, through friendships, through communities. You had seen what desperation turned people into. And so, as you walked past the graves that had been hastily dug in frozen earth, past the empty homes where people had once lived, you didn't celebrate. You simply nodded, wiped your hands, fed the fire, and waited for the next season. Because survival wasn't about being happy, it was about making it to the next day, to the next season, to the next harvest. And when you saw that first sprout in the garden, that first green leaf, you didn't smile. You didn't cheer. You just watched it grow, careful not to jinx it, careful not to expect too much too soon. Because in the medieval world, expectation wasn't just an invitation for disappointment, it was a dangerous luxury. As spring pushed its way into the land, it didn't exactly sweep away the memories of the winter's bite. The cold might have retreated, but the scars left behind were stubborn. You could see it in the way people moved and how they spoke less, laughed less, trusted less. Every day was a reminder of what they had lost. Spring, for all its promises, was a time of reckoning. The earth thawed, but your body, your mind, your soul, they weren't as quick to heal. Bones were still cracked and hearts were still aching. But the work had to go on. You had to plant, you had to rebuild, you had to fight for the little that the land would offer you. Every person had their own scars and everyone wore them in different ways. The old woman at the market who no longer spoke, just looked at you with empty eyes. The young man who had been kind last summer but now avoided eye contact, as though something inside him had changed. The mother who no longer smiled when she saw you, only stared at the ground, the loss of her child still too fresh, too raw. Survival wasn't just about physical endurance. It was about mental fortitude. How long could you keep going without losing yourself? How much pain could you absorb before your body and mind just stopped working? People pushed through, sure, but not all of them came out of it intact. Some people never found their way back to themselves. They kept working, kept moving, but their spirit was somewhere else, lost in the wilderness of grief. And yet life went on. You couldn't stop for long. The field still needed to be tilled. The animals still needed feeding. The house still needed repairing. Spring demanded your labor just as winter had. There was no time to sit still and mourn. You worked through the aches in your bones, through the grief that gnawed at your insides, because the land didn't wait. The seasons didn't care. And the church, it was still there, always watching, always judging. With the first warm day, the familiar smell of earth came up from the soil. It was a strange thing. It made you think that maybe this year the harvest would be better. That maybe, just maybe, the land would give back a little more than it had before. But you couldn't hold on to that hope for long. Because hope was a double-edged sword. Too much hope could break you when the rains didn't come, or when the crops withered under an unexpected frost. But too little hope meant giving in to despair before you even tried. You couldn't afford to despair though. Not yet. Not when there was still a chance. Not when survival still depended on a few good months of work. You had to get through the planting season, get through the long days of sweat and toil, counting each turn of the soil as if it were your lifeline. People would often say that they survived for the sake of others. For their families, for their children, for the community. But deep down, you knew that survival was a personal thing. It wasn't just about others. It was about your own will to keep going, to endure when every fiber of your being screamed for rest. The work didn't stop no matter how tired you were. You couldn't afford to rest for long. The weight of the world felt like it was pressing down on your chest every single day. But you just kept going. The church bells rang. It was time for Mass. You didn't question the bell. You didn't question the priest. You didn't question anything. You just went, sat in the cold stone church and let the words wash over you. It's all part of God's plan, they said. Maybe. Maybe not. But you kept going anyway. And then came the long nights, when the wind howled outside and the fire crackled weakly in the hearth. You wrapped yourself in wool blankets, closed your eyes, and tried not to think too hard about what the next season might bring. Maybe it would be a little better. Maybe the harvest would be enough to fill your belly, to carry you through the next winter. Maybe the church would be kinder this year. Maybe. But hope was always a fragile thing. Too fragile to hold on to for long. And as soon as the days grew longer, as soon as you thought the worst had passed, you were reminded that in the medieval world, you could never be certain of anything. Life, death, the land, the harvest, the church. None of it was certain. But you kept working anyway. You had to. What else could you do? As the seasons began to change, so did the very rhythm of life itself. Spring was meant to be a time of rebirth, of renewal, but in truth, it often felt like it was just another season of struggle. Even as the first green shoots pushed through the thawing earth, there was something else growing too, the weight of invisible wounds. Survival in the medieval world wasn't just about the body. The soul too was constantly under siege. Grief, guilt, and fear were silent companions, always lurking, always present. It was in the way you looked at a neighbor and saw the same hollow look in their eyes, the way the silence between you and your family became too much to bear. It was the way you could no longer hear the birds in the morning without thinking of the ones you had lost. You began to understand that endurance wasn't just about keeping your body alive, it was about keeping your mind intact. Each day you had to pull yourself out of the darkness, face the heavy weight of all the things you couldn't change, and get back to work. But how do you keep fighting when everything around you feels like it's slowly falling apart? That question haunted many, and it wasn't just the elders or those who had lived through years of hardship. Even the young felt the scars of the world they were born into. Children who never laughed the way they once did, who no longer chased each other in the fields or ran to the market with joy. The innocence of childhood had been replaced by a quiet, wary awareness of survival. They were learning far too soon that life was about getting through, not living. In the dead of night, when the village was wrapped in its familiar stillness, some would lie awake and think of the things they'd lost. The whispers of those who had disappeared, the faces of children who never made it through the cold, the families torn apart by famine and illness. The silence felt deafening even in the spring. You knew you weren't the only one haunted by these thoughts, but that didn't make them any easier to carry. Sometimes you'd sit by the fire and watch the flames dance, their warmth a comfort against the ever-present chill of the world. You'd wonder if anyone truly saw what you were carrying. Could they see the pain behind your eyes? Could they understand the weight of all that had been lost, all that you had sacrificed just to survive another day? But no, they didn't. They were too busy fighting their own battles, too consumed by their own fears, their own struggles. The weight of it all often felt like it was pressing down on your chest, and there were moments when you could feel the pressure building, threatening to crack you open. Were you even meant to survive this? The thought slipped in when you least expected it, and it was hard to dismiss. The older folks might say that it was God's will, that every trial was a test of faith, but in your heart, you knew that survival wasn't always so neat and tidy. It was messy. It was ugly. It was full of doubt, fear, and loneliness. You did everything you could to keep going, but there were days when the struggle felt impossible. And no one, no matter how devout, no matter how strong, was immune to those moments when hope seemed like a distant memory, and all you could hold on to was the faintest thread of endurance. Perhaps it was the church that gave people a reason to keep going. Maybe it was the belief that there was a purpose to all of this, that the suffering would somehow be worth it in the end. But the reality of the situation was hard to ignore. Life was short and it was hard. You couldn't help but wonder whether the God of the church truly cared about every lost soul, or if he too was just waiting for the end of it all. You held on to the rituals of faith because they were the only thing that made sense in a world that had long stopped making sense. The prayers, the saints, the signs, they gave you something to hold on to, even if only for a moment. The church wasn't just a place of worship. It was a place to hide, a place to be reminded that you weren't alone in your suffering. There, you could pretend that everything was part of God's plan, even if deep down, you wondered if the plan had gone terribly wrong somewhere. But then again, what choice did you have but to keep believing? What else could you turn to when the cold and the hunger were still as fierce as they had ever been? when the world seemed as unkind as ever. Faith was the one thing that could give you enough strength to get up and try again. It wasn't a perfect answer, and it certainly wasn't a happy one, but it was the answer you had. And so you prayed. You prayed for those who had passed, for those still here, for the land, for the food that would come. You prayed for forgiveness, for protection, for guidance. The prayers weren't always about hope. They were about survival. They were about keeping your soul intact when the world threatened to crush it. Spring is never easy. Although the cold has retreated and the fields are slowly recovering, you now face a different kind of battle. A battle that can't be immediately seen, but is always present, hidden beneath the daily tasks. The price paid for winter has not yet faded. It lies in the earth, in the cracks of the old wall, in the silent conversations. And these are things you cannot see until everything is over. Spring is a time to start again, but some things can never return to how they were. The lives that were lost, the mirrors that were forgotten, and the endurance you had to go through, whether you wanted to or not, will shape you for the rest of your life. Endurance is not a grand victory. It's not about joy or pride. Endurance is simply a small victory, a way for you to keep living when all you have left is one more step. You will never forget the coldest days of your life. The long nights, the foggy mornings where every breath was cold. There were times when you weren't just enduring the cold outside, but also fighting against the past, the unspoken fears that had not been erased, the questions no one could answer. How many times did you ask yourself, will things ever get better? The history of the poor has always been written in silence because their stories rarely have a voice. Their memories, their sufferings, are only recorded by faint marks in the land. They leave behind no kings, no great legacies, only the scars of endurance, things you couldn't see until they passed you by. Every person in the village is part of a collective story, a piece of a puzzle that will never quite fit. But if all you have is endurance, that might be the mark you leave on this world. Maybe you won't become someone everyone remembers for generations, but you will leave something. Endurance is your quiet rebellion against fate. You didn't just survive, you carried on when it seemed like everything else was falling apart. You will never forget those longest nights of your life. Those endless days when the cold and hunger gnawed at you, when the weight of the world seemed to press down upon your shoulders. And there were moments when you didn't just endure the cold. You fought with the shadows of your past, with memories that refused to fade, with the fear of the unknown that gripped you tighter than any frostbite could. But still you endured. Throughout history, endurance has always been part of the human experience. From the oldest civilizations to the poorest peasants of the medieval world, every life carries its weight of suffering. Every person has their own version of endurance. And although it might not be the most glamorous aspect of life, it is often the most profound. You may not become the hero of history, but you are still part of it. You leave behind stories not in the way kings and conquerors do, but in the way someone who endured hardship and came out the other side does. You are not just surviving, you are enduring, and that is a victory in itself. History doesn't always remember the names of the forgotten, but the endurance they show, the way they persist in the face of everything, is what shapes this world. It is not always glamorous. It is often quiet, humble, and unnoticed, but it is real. And in this quiet endurance, we find the true strength of human spirit. Endurance is what lets us carry on. It is the thing that keeps us moving forward even when we can't see the end. We may not win every battle, but surviving is enough. Endurance is not a grand triumph. It is a small, everyday victory that adds up over time. And even though you may not see it now, this endurance will define you. It will shape your future, your actions, and your legacy. Because when the world throws everything it has at you, the only thing left to do is endure. You may not always understand it, but you will keep moving. That is the strength that endurance gives you. As the days grow longer, the weight of spring becomes just as heavy as winter's burden. You may find the sun a welcome warmth, but there is something about this time that doesn't quite feel like renewal. You look at the fields, and yes, there are green sprouts beginning to appear, but they are fragile. They are still young, still vulnerable, just like the hope that has come with them. The soil is still full of what it once was: rock, root, and rot. And yet, every year we hope because we have to. Hope is like a small seed you plant in the dirt. You nurture it with what little you have and wait, often in silence. But just like the earth, it isn't always easy. The earth is stubborn, unwilling to just give in to your efforts. It takes time, and sometimes it refuses to give what you thought was owed. You've worked hard, but now comes the time of waiting. The work doesn't stop, it simply becomes quieter. Spring, though it promises change, is still too young to be trusted. It takes time for crops to grow, for food to be harvested, and for the land to become the thing you thought it would be. So, what are you supposed to do now? The burden of the past isn't so easily shaken off. The trauma, the scars of everything you endured during winter, are still there, still waiting for you. No matter how many times you wake up to the sun's warmth, no matter how many crops sprout, you know deep inside that winter's grip is not something easily forgotten. This season is supposed to be one of renewal, but you can't quite feel it yet. The land is reluctant to give, and the past still lingers in the corners of your mind. You see it in the silence, in the way people move, in the way their eyes glance away when they speak of what's been lost. Spring, though it offers the possibility of growth, is also a reminder of what remains dormant. It's easy to look at the new life and believe that the worst is behind you, but the truth is more complicated. There's a price for every season, for every harvest, and every attempt at renewal. The ground doesn't forget what it's been through, and neither do you. This season of waiting, this season of quiet recovery, is also a time to remember what you've lost, what you've given up, and what you've yet to reclaim. The church may tell you that faith is what will carry you through, and perhaps it is. But in these moments, faith is more like a flicker than a flame. It's small, it's fragile, and it's often hidden under layers of fear and grief. The spiritual does not always feel strong enough to hold up the weight of real life, the one that is full of cold nights, empty stomachs, and forgotten dreams. But still the work continues. You plant the seeds, you rebuild the walls, and you pick up the broken pieces of the world around you. You do it because you have no choice, because the future depends on it, but also because endurance is more than just surviving. It's living through the cycles, even when those cycles feel like they have no end. It's in these moments, in this waiting, that you truly understand the weight of the future. The future isn't always a distant thing. It's something you shape with every choice, every action, and every quiet endurance. The land will grow, and so will you, but it will never be as easy as it seems. The future is just as uncertain as the past, but it is also something you must embrace, no matter how uncertain or broken it may feel. The more you wait, the more you learn that it's not just about surviving. It's about living with the past, walking through the uncertainty of the future, and continuing in the present, even when everything around you suggests that things may never get better. The question isn't whether you can endure, but whether you will. The spring will come, just as it always does, but only if you remain committed, only if you continue to carry the weight. It's this endurance, this quiet strength that builds the future. Even when the seasons shift, even when the past clings to you like the frost, you learn that survival doesn't always look like a grand victory. It doesn't always look like joy or triumph. Sometimes survival looks like getting up each morning despite everything, despite the doubts, despite the losses. Survival is just one more step forward. Endurance is everything else. As you take one step forward, there's an unspoken truth that starts to weigh heavier with each passing day. Survival, while seemingly the most basic of human instincts, comes with its own price, often one you don't see immediately and often not one you're prepared for. It's not always about battling the cold, gathering food, or finding shelter. Sometimes, survival is about the invisible cost, the toll it takes on your soul, your mind, and even your relationships. The longer you survive, the more complicated the act of living becomes. You might find that things are no longer as simple as just getting through another day. The scarcity, the struggle, the endless work can erode your spirit in ways you didn't expect. Your body might be intact, but your mind is frayed, worn down by the relentlessness of it all. Even when the crops grow, when the earth begins to breathe again, there's still something missing. It's not just about food or shelter anymore. It's about meaning. It's about purpose. For all the work you put into the soil, into your family, into your community, there's a quiet voice that starts to ask, what does it all mean? You've survived another winter, but are you really living? Or are you just existing? You work because you have to. You plant because the season demands it. You laugh sometimes, but it's the kind of laugh that's empty, automatic. A mask that hides a deeper, more desperate longing for something beyond mere survival. And then there are the others. The people around you, your neighbors, your family. They are all walking this same fragile line between living and existing. And you notice it in them too, the exhaustion in their eyes, the stiffness in their movements. They are here, they are alive, but are they truly living? Communities in times like these are fragile. You might come together for work, for harvest, for the sake of survival, but when the work stops, when the external pressure of survival is lifted, what's left? Relationships are tested by hunger, by hardship, and by a shared experience of endurance that often doesn't leave much room for emotional connection. You see it in the way people look at each other, sometimes with understanding, sometimes with distrust. They share everything, but they don't share everything. The bonds you form aren't always as strong as you'd like to believe. Survival doesn't always unite people in the ways you think it will. Sometimes it drives them apart. Sometimes, it makes you question whether the relationships you have are built on anything more than mutual need. Survival, in its harshest form, makes you question the very nature of human connection. Are we here for each other, or are we here because we have no other choice? The ones you rely on the most can sometimes be the ones you least understand. People act differently when they're pushed to the edge. The fear, the pain, the survival instinct often bring out something in people that you don't recognize, or worse, something you wish you didn't have to see. But that's the truth. That's the cost. Survival isn't just about fighting the world. It's about fighting yourself, your own fears, your own desires, your own sense of who you are when everything around you breaks down. And when the world doesn't make sense anymore, when it feels like everything is a struggle, there's a danger in losing yourself. You can become so focused on the next step that you forget to look up, to see the world around you, to really see the people you're with. There's a quiet kind of emptiness that can come from living this way, one that doesn't always show up on the surface. The bodies are fine. The fields are full. But the souls? The souls feel like they're starving too. You may be surrounded by people, but that doesn't mean you're connected to them. You might sleep in the same house, sit at the same fire, but the distance between you and them grows with each passing season of struggle. As spring slowly gives way to summer, you might find that life continues to shift, and the pressure eases. But, like all things, survival is cyclical. It's a cycle that repeats. You breathe in, you breathe out. You plant, you harvest. You live, you die. And as you live, you learn. You learn how to carry the weight, how to survive the pressure, how to endure the cost. But it's never truly over. There's always the next season, always the next challenge waiting for you. Survival never truly ends. It simply changes its form, and you have to adapt over and over just to stay standing. Part of surviving is knowing when to let go. Not everything is meant to be carried forever. Sometimes you have to learn to let go of the past, to release the weight of what you thought you had to hold on to. Only then can you truly begin to understand what survival means, not just in the body but in the soul. It's this quiet lesson in letting go, in finding a way to release the burdens that no longer serve you, that will carry you through. Because survival at its core is not just about holding on. It's about knowing what to release and what to keep, what to endure and what to let fall. Survival isn't just the act of living. It's the art of knowing when to keep going and when to stop, breathe and let yourself heal. As the seasons change and life presses forward, there's an inevitable realization that starts to sink in. Survival isn't just about enduring the hardships, it's about facing the reality of what those hardships have done to you. Endurance, while a necessary tool, comes at a cost that no one tells you about until you've lived through it. The physical toll is obvious: worn hands, cracked skin, aching muscles. But the emotional cost, the quiet breaking of the spirit, is more insidious. comes slowly like a creeping fog, until one day you wake up and realize you've become a different person. The person you were before the cold, before the hunger, before the endless cycle of work and worry, that person seems almost like a distant memory. You may still remember their laugh, their dreams. The person you were before survival became your only focus. But now, as you stand in the aftermath, staring at the remnants of your hard-won existence, you wonder who you've become in the process. In the middle of all of this survival, something crucial is lost. Hope. Hope, like everything else, becomes a currency. You can hold on to it as long as it serves you, but when it starts to feel like the world is out of your control, hope becomes harder to hold on to. You begin to question whether your prayers, your efforts, your sacrifices have ever mattered. And when you're standing in the rubble, looking at the ashes of your dreams, you can't help but wonder if there's any point to it all. What happens when survival itself begins to feel like a trap? What happens when the very thing that has kept you alive for so long, your tenacity, your refusal to give up, becomes the thing that holds you prisoner? When all your focus is on getting through another day, another year, another season, the years start to blur together. You realize you've been surviving, but you've forgotten how to live. So you pause. Just for a moment. You stop and ask yourself, what happens when you stop surviving? When the cold doesn't have control over you anymore, when the hunger fades away, when the relentless grind of survival finally slows down. What do you have left when it's all stripped away? When survival isn't the primary goal anymore. This is the final reckoning. It's the moment you realize that life has become a cycle, a repeating pattern of trying to make it through. But eventually the grind stops. Maybe it's when the harvest is finally plentiful. Maybe it's when the fields are full and the earth is forgiving. Maybe it's when the sun shines and the warmth of the season returns. The work doesn't stop, but for the first time in a long time, you feel like you have space to breathe. The question becomes, what do you do with that space? You've spent so much of your life surviving, so much time on autopilot, that you've forgotten what it means to truly live. To feel, to experience, to dream. And now that the dust settles, now that the grip of survival has loosened, you're left with yourself, perhaps for the first time in a long time. But this reckoning, this moment of self-reflection, isn't always easy. There's a fear that comes with it, a fear of what you'll find when you look too closely. After all, you've survived, but you've also sacrificed parts of yourself to get here. You might be physically intact, but how much of your soul has been worn down by the struggle? How much of your heart has become calloused over the years? It's easy to be overwhelmed by that realization. It's easy to believe that you've lost too much, that you've given too much, that the person you were before the hardship began no longer exists. But the truth is you've changed, yes, but you're still here. You've survived, and in that survival, you've discovered something new about yourself, something raw and honest. You've discovered a resilience that wasn't there before, a depth of strength that you didn't know existed within you. It's not about the person you were before. It's about the person you've become because of it all. And though survival has its price, it also has its gift. The gift of understanding. The gift of self-awareness. The understanding that while the world may try to break you, while the struggles may seem endless, you have an inner strength that can carry you through even the toughest of times. And in that moment, as you look back at the path you've walked, the mountains you've climbed, the rivers you've crossed, the storms you've weathered, you realize that it wasn't all for nothing. Every step, every moment, every sacrifice has shaped who you are now. And that person is not just a survivor. That person is a warrior, someone who knows what it means to endure and to thrive despite the odds. So you stand tall, even as the weight of the past tries to press you down. You hold your head high because you know that survival is not the end of the story, it's the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where you are no longer defined by the struggle, but by the strength that came from it. And as you step forward, you realize that survival has given you something precious, the opportunity to start over, to build something new, to live again, not just to endure, but to flourish. The final reckoning is not about looking back at what was lost, but about looking forward to what can still be gained. It's about taking what you've learned, the strength you've built, and using it to create the life you've always wanted. The life where you don't just survive, you thrive. And in the end, that's the real victory. Not surviving, but living. As spring gradually unfurls its green fingers, bringing with it new growth and the promise of warmth, there's a strange stillness that fills the air. You've survived the worst, yes, but now you're left to deal with something more insidious, the weight of the future. After all that struggle, after all that sacrifice, what now? What happens when the storm finally passes, and the silence that follows is both comforting and unsettling? It's hard to put into words, this feeling that lingers in the stillness. It's not quite fear, but it's definitely an unease. There's a part of you that wonders if you've become so accustomed to the struggle that you don't know how to exist without it. The last few months, the freezing cold, the hunger, the exhaustion, they've all shaped you in ways you might not fully understand yet. You've become a person who knows how to survive, how to endure, but now with the weather warming, the challenges aren't as obvious. And you don't know what to do with yourself when the need to survive isn't as pressing. But this new phase, the one after survival, is just as important as the one before it. It's easy to forget that survival is only part of the equation. The other part is learning how to live again, how to rebuild, not just physically but emotionally, spiritually. For so long, you've been consumed by the fight to stay alive, the fight against the elements, the hunger, the cold. But now, with that struggle slowing down, you have to face the reality of what comes next. The future isn't as simple as another winter, another set of obstacles to overcome. The future is a blank page and you get to write the next chapter. You might think that after all the hardship, all the trials, you would immediately know what to do next. But the truth is that's not always the case. The blank page is overwhelming. The new season is intimidating, not because it's filled with obstacles, but because it's filled with possibility. What do you do when the struggle is over? How do you carry the lessons you've learned and use them to build something more than just survival? The hardest part about this transition isn't the work, it's the shift in mindset. For so long you've been focused on getting by, on making it through. But now you have to learn how to focus on growth. The same hands that have cracked open rocks and endured the bitter chill of winter must now plant seeds, tend to new life, nurture things that will grow. And this is a different kind of work, a more delicate one. The survival instincts that served you well in the cold, hard months must now be turned inward. You need patience, understanding, and the courage to take risks again. But even with that awareness, the change isn't immediate. You can't just shake off the years of struggle and suddenly become someone new. The scars of winter still linger. The grief, the loss, the trauma, they don't disappear with the thaw. They stay with you, wrapped in the very fabric of who you are now. It's not something you can forget, nor should you. The person you've become because of those hardships is someone to be proud of, someone who has endured in ways most people can't imagine. The beauty of spring, though, lies in the ability to transform that past into strength. You don't forget the struggle. You take it with you and you allow it to inform the way you move forward. The harvest of your efforts in the past few seasons wasn't just about crops or food. It was about who you are becoming, who you were always meant to be beneath the weight of it all. And now, with the world opening up again, you have the chance to redefine yourself. And yet, even with all the hope spring brings, there's still the reality of the unknown. The future may look brighter, but it still comes with uncertainties. The past season of struggle has taught you that nothing is guaranteed. The soil may not always yield what you expect. The rains may come too late, the winds may be too harsh. But that doesn't mean you stop planting. It doesn't mean you stop trying. It just means you approach life differently now. You no longer expect the world to simply give you what you need. You've learned that everything has a price, that growth comes at the cost of sacrifice, and that nothing is ever handed to you without effort. In this new chapter, the work doesn't stop. It never will. But the purpose behind it changes. It's no longer about surviving. It's about living with intention, with direction. The struggle becomes part of your story, but it's no longer the whole story. It's not the defining feature of who you are. Instead, what defines you now is the way you choose to move forward, how you take the lessons of the past and transform them into something new. You'll never be the person you were before the long winters, before the hardship, before the hunger. And that's okay. In fact, that's exactly how it should be. You've grown into someone stronger, someone wiser, someone who knows what it means to endure and who understands the value of persistence. And now, in this new season, you get to build something. Not from a place of scarcity, but from a place of strength and resilience. The next chapter is yours to write. So write it well. As you begin to step into the future, there's an undeniable pull that draws your thoughts back to the past. It's impossible to completely leave behind the memories of the winter you survived, the long months of struggle. Those days, those nights, are etched into your bones, carried with you in every step you take. But as you begin to breathe again, there's a growing sense that you must honor the survival that has carried you this far. You've learned how to endure, how to hold on in the face of overwhelming odds. Now you must learn how to pass that knowledge forward. The future is not just a place where you exist, it's a place where your survival will inspire others. The people around you, the ones who walked beside you through the cold, who shared in the hunger, the sorrow, and the occasional fleeting moments of joy, are all still part of the larger story. And just as you learned from the past, it's time for you to pass on the legacy of survival. Not just as a survival story, but as a message. A reminder that in the harshest of times, strength can be found in the quietest of moments, in the smallest of actions. In the seasons when you feel least alive, those are the moments that build your legacy. As you look at the world around you, you begin to realize something crucial. Survival is not just about making it through the next storm. It's about how you live in the aftermath. How you choose to rise after the ground has cracked. How you rebuild what has been destroyed. Every field you till, every seed you plant, is a statement of your resilience. Every meal you share, every conversation, every decision to move forward, is an act of rebellion against the seasons of suffering that have tried to break you. You're not just surviving anymore. You're living with purpose, with meaning. But the hardest part, perhaps, is seeing others who are still in the struggle. Those who haven't yet felt the warmth of spring, who are still locked in the grip of winter, still battling against forces that feel too strong to overcome. In those moments, you'll remember what it felt like to be on the other side. You'll remember how hard it was to believe that warmth would ever come, that life would ever feel light again. But as time passes, you come to understand that the only way to help someone is not to simply give them what you've earned, but to teach them how to earn it themselves. This is the legacy of survival, the knowledge that no matter the depth of the cold, you can rise again. You have the power to rebuild, to endure, and to live. Survival is not about escaping the winter, but about learning to thrive in its wake. It's about finding meaning in the struggle, and it's about giving that meaning to others. When you've walked through fire, when you've made it to the other side, your story becomes more than just your own. It becomes a part of the fabric of the community, of the land, of the generations to come. It's woven into the threads of every conversation, every shared laugh, every kind word. And as you look at the land that you've worked, at the seeds you've sown, you realize that the true value of what you've built isn't in the physical things. It's in the intangible. It's in the strength you carry within yourself, the courage that lives in your heart, the ability to face the unknown with eyes wide open. That's the legacy you leave behind. Not riches, not buildings, not trophies, but the enduring, quiet strength to face whatever comes next. You'll see the fruits of your labor not just in the harvests, but in the quiet moments that remind you of the resilience you've earned. A smile on the face of a child. A hand reaching out to help a neighbor. A song sung around the fire. These are the true rewards of survival, the ability to find joy, even in the harshest of circumstances. The knowledge that, no matter what, you have the strength to face another season. So as the seasons change and the earth begins to turn once more, remember this: survival is not a destination. It's a journey. A journey of strength, of resilience, of growth. It's a journey that doesn't end when the storms pass, but when you choose to live beyond them. And in that living you will leave a legacy not of what you have, but of what you've become. The world may change, the seasons may shift, but the truth remains. The greatest victory is not in the survival of the body but in the survival of the soul. As the days grow longer and the first hints of warmth return, it becomes apparent that survival doesn't simply end when the ice melts or when the last snowdrift disappears. The change in the seasons isn't just a shift in the weather. It's a transformation within you, a subtle but powerful reminder that the cold you endured wasn't the enemy, it was the test. And now, as you move through the warmth, you find yourself not just free from the grip of winter but changed by the experience. You begin to realize that what you've been through has altered you in ways that words cannot fully express. The hunger, the cold, the isolation, they have left their mark, but those marks are no longer scars. They are the foundations of your strength. In the quiet moments, when you stand in the sunlight and feel the warmth on your skin, it's clear that you are no longer the same person who fought through the storms. You are someone stronger, someone who has learned the value of endurance, of patience, and of finding peace within chaos. But this transformation doesn't happen overnight. It's not like flipping a switch and suddenly everything is easier. There's still work to be done, still challenges ahead. But now, when you face those challenges, you know that you have already faced the worst. You've conquered the unthinkable. You've endured the deepest of winters and survived it. And that knowledge, that inner conviction, makes every challenge that comes afterward feel more manageable. You now understand that survival is not just about getting through the hard times, but about coming out the other side better, wiser, and stronger. The true test of your strength isn't how you survive the hard times, but how you live in the aftermath. When the dust settles, when the cold has passed, when the hunger is no longer gnawing at your insides, that's when the real work begins. That's when you must rebuild, not just the physical structures around you, but the pieces of yourself that winter tried to break. You need to look at the person you've become, at the lessons you've learned, and begin to grow from there. The world around you is waking up, and with it, you are too. But the thing about waking up after a long winter is that everything feels new but also familiar. The ground feels different beneath your feet, the air smells fresh, but you know that the hard lessons of the past will never be fully gone. They have shaped you. They are part of who you are now. And as you step forward into the warmth, you begin to understand that survival isn't just about making it through. It's about learning to live, truly live, once you've made it. The sun begins to shine, the grass starts to grow, and the days stretch longer, but your journey is far from over. You've learned that growth doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in community. It happens when you share your knowledge, your lessons, and your experiences with those who are still in the struggle, with those who need to hear your story. Because even though the worst of winter is over, there are still storms on the horizon. There are still challenges that lie ahead. But you are no longer the person you were when you first began this journey. You've become a beacon of strength, a reminder that even the hardest winters come to an end. You share your knowledge with others. How to plant when the soil is hard, how to endure when the winds are harsh, how to survive when everything around you seems to be falling apart. You teach them not just the practical skills but the inner strength that comes from making it through. You become the person who shows others the way forward, who helps them find their footing when they can't see the path ahead. You become part of the story of resilience, of survival, of triumph over adversity. And as the warmth of spring settles in, you realize that your survival wasn't just for you. It was for the ones who will follow, for the ones who still need to learn, for the ones who need to see that it's possible to survive the worst and still find beauty, still find hope, still find strength. The work continues, the challenges remain, but now they seem less daunting. They are just part of the cycle. Winter will come again, but so will spring. And when it does, you will be ready, not just to survive, but to thrive. As the frost finally releases its grip on the land, something deep within you shifts. Spring doesn't just bring warmer weather, it brings a fresh start, a new beginning, and with it, a renewed sense of purpose. The soil, now soft and ready, calls you to begin again. It invites you to plant seeds not just in the ground but in your own heart. This season isn't just about surviving anymore. It's about living with intention, about thriving after everything that's been left behind in the wake of winter. You've been through hell. You felt the sting of hunger, the weight of loneliness, and the crushing burden of uncertainty. But now, as you breathe in the warm air, you realize that none of it has defeated you. It has forged you into someone unrecognizable to the person who entered the winter months. You've endured the hardest test imaginable, and you've come out of it not just alive but more connected to your own strength than ever before. But don't be fooled, spring is not an easy rest. It's a season of renewal, but renewal comes with work. The landscape may have thawed, but the challenges are still there. The land might be ready to be tilled, but your hands are rough from the struggle. The buds on the trees might signal hope, but those trees still need nurturing to bear fruit. Just like your own spirit, though it has thawed in the warmth of spring, it too needs care and intention to grow into something that can withstand whatever future storms may come. You start to notice the subtle ways in which your body, mind, and soul are healing. The ache in your joints isn't as deep as it once was, but it's still there. Your heart doesn't ache as often with the weight of the past, but it remembers, and it will never forget what it has endured. And that's okay. You should never forget. The hard seasons are part of the story, part of what makes you who you are now. You aren't just a survivor of winter. You're a warrior who has learned that the hardest battles leave the deepest imprints. In this season of growth, you can't ignore the scars left behind. They are a part of you. But what matters now is how you move forward, how you choose to grow. Spring doesn't erase the past, it builds upon it. Just like the soil that now nurtures new life, your experience in the coldest months has become the fertile ground for your personal growth. As you work the land, planting seeds, tending to crops, you realize that you are also planting seeds within yourself. Every small action, every step toward progress, is a seed being sown into the future. You are not just waiting for the future to arrive, you are shaping it with every choice you make. You know now that nothing in life is certain and nothing is promised, but that doesn't mean you should stop planting, stop hoping, or stop growing. The resilience you've built during the harshest of times now becomes the foundation on which you stand. And just as you are learning to nurture the land, you begin to see the importance of nurturing your relationships. The struggle you've faced together with others during the cold, bitter months has forged bonds that now, more than ever, feel unbreakable. You've seen each other at your worst, and yet here you are, still standing together. Spring is a time for connection, for sharing the burden of rebuilding, and for celebrating the strength that has been born out of shared suffering. But let's be honest, rebuilding isn't easy. It requires more than just physical labor. It requires mental and emotional effort. It's about finding the strength to forgive, to let go of the resentments that may have built up during the tough months. It's about learning to trust again, not just in others, but in yourself. It's about discovering new ways to love and care for the people who walked through the cold with you, even when you didn't know if you could make it. In the quiet moments, as you sit beside the newly sprouted crops or watch the sun dip below the horizon, you begin to understand the true power of this season. Spring is a time for healing, for letting go of what no longer serves you, and for embracing the possibilities that the future holds. The spring breeze whispers promises of renewal, but it also carries the reminder that this cycle of life, of survival, of growth, will continue forever. Each year will bring its challenges, its moments of doubt, but it will also bring opportunities to become stronger, more resilient, more connected. Spring, like life, is fleeting. It doesn't last forever. But that's what makes it all the more precious. You don't take it for granted. You know the cold will return. It always does. But now you're ready. You've faced the worst and you've emerged stronger for it. You've learned the art of survival, the strength of resilience, and the power of community. As the seasons change, you will continue to grow, continue to plant, continue to hope. You will nurture the garden of your life, knowing that the roots you've planted in the hardest of times will sustain you when the winds of winter return. And no matter what comes your way, you will be ready, stronger, wiser, and more capable than you ever thought possible. Even as spring settles in and the world seems to stretch and yawn back to life, there's something in the air that doesn't quite lift. A heaviness that clings to the corners of barns, the quiet spaces between meals, the sound of the wind through half-repaired shutters. It's not grief exactly. Grief is loud. This is quieter, more persistent, like an echo that refuses to fade. You don't speak of it directly, but it's there, in the way people pause before laughing, in how they glance at the empty spots around the hearth, in the silence between songs. You feel it too. That haunting stillness. That knowledge of what it took to get here. It doesn't paralyze you, but it never fully leaves either. Survival came at a cost, and though you paid it without choice, the receipt lingers in your memory. In the Middle Ages, people didn't have the luxury of processing trauma the way we talk about it now. There were no counselors, no support groups. Just the work. Just the fields. Just your own two hands and the understanding that nobody was coming to save you. And so, instead of talking about pain, you planted turnips. Instead of naming your sorrow, you mended the fence. You measured your progress in mended boots, patched roofs, and planted rows. It wasn't healing in the modern sense. It was motion. It was something. And in that something, there was a strange kind of grace. The ones who came through the winter alongside you, those bonds didn't need words. They were forged in silence, in shared hardship, in the way someone handed you the last of their bread without needing to explain. You didn't have to say, thank you. You just remembered, and one day you'd return the favor. That was the way of things. Loyalty wasn't a loud declaration. It was quietly splitting your firewood with a neighbor whose axe broke. It was watching someone's children while they walked 2 villages away for medicine that might not even exist. Even now, months later, that understanding remains. You pass people in the fields, in the narrow paths between houses, and you don't ask what they lost. You just nod. That's enough. Everyone carries something. Everyone remembers someone. You don't need to name it. Pain doesn't ask for attention. It just sits beside you as you work, like a shadow that no longer surprises you. You begin to notice the way people shift slowly back into themselves. The man who hadn't spoken since February hums a tune while whittling. A girl plays in the dirt with a stick and a rock, laughing like she doesn't know what hunger feels like. A woman who buried her sister in the coldest week of January stands a little straighter when she carries water from the well. These are not miracles. These are not celebrations. They are tiny victories. And they matter. Because in this world, joy doesn't arrive in grand gestures. It sneaks in. It hides in small things. A loaf of bread that doesn't crumble when cut, a morning without frost on the windows, a rooster that crows like it's daring the world to try again. These moments don't erase the hardship, but they remind you that life, stubborn and ragged and relentless, still wants to be lived. And you begin to look forward again. Not with the naive hope you might have once had, but with a kind of earned optimism. You don't expect ease. You don't believe suffering is done. But you know that you've endured once and you can endure again. And maybe, just maybe, the next time the cold comes, you'll be a little better prepared. Not just in supplies, but in spirit. The land remembers too. You see it in the way wildflowers sprout at the edges of the fields you haven't tilled yet. In the way the trees seem to lean a little fuller. The birds return with new songs, ones you swear you've never heard before. Nature, like the people, isn't celebrating, it's reclaiming, rebuilding, starting the cycle over. You mark the days not by feast days or tides, but by real signs. The first rain that doesn't freeze, the second sprout in your garden, the third night you sleep without waking in panic at some sound in the dark. The calendar doesn't define the return of life. You do. And still the church looms, not in menace but in memory. You still go. You still pray. Maybe not for miracles now, but for steadiness. For enough. For protection, not from sin but from hunger. From another too long winter. The priest's sermons still echo with fire and fear, but now you hear something else beneath them. A community trying to make sense of survival. Trying to frame the suffering in divine context. Maybe it helps. Maybe it doesn't. But in a world where so much is uncertain, faith remains one of the only tools you have to make meaning of the chaos. Your children grow. They don't remember the worst of it. They remember stories, warnings, the caution in your voice when the wind blows from the north. But they laugh freely. They run. And you let them. Because joy must have a place in all of this, or what was the point? You survived so they wouldn't have to suffer in the same way, even if you know deep down they still might. But for now you let them live without fear. That's the gift you give them. And as summer approaches and the fields begin to promise a harvest, you do something rare. You smile. Not because you've forgotten, but because you remember, and you're still here. Summer doesn't arrive all at once. It trickles in slowly, through warmer mornings, longer light, and air that carries less threat. You notice it in the soil first. Softer. Richer. The way your tools bite into it without protest. The way your knees don't ache quite as much when you bend to plant. Then comes the sun, timid at first, then bold. And with it the village begins to change. Where there was silence, there's now the sound of children shouting, of goats bleating, of hammers tapping. No longer the hollow sounds of survival, now they're the sounds of rebuilding. Repairing carts. Mending fences. Stretching hides. People talk more. They linger after chores. Share stories. Laugh sometimes for real. And yet, even with the light, there's an invisible toll left behind. A cost etched in habits no one talks about. You catch yourself counting firewood even when it's warm. You measure flour out of instinct, not necessity. You still listen too closely at night. And you're not alone. Everyone does it. It's the tax winter left behind, the residue of fear, the reflex of caution. Because peace in this world isn't a reward. It's a break. A breath. A temporary calm that only means the storm has moved on, for now. You live in a cycle of preparation. Harvest is no longer just a blessing. It's a defense strategy. A well-packed cellar is hope, a stacked woodpile is reassurance, and a thick coat is a promise you whisper to yourself when the wind starts to change again. And there's always the fear that peace will soften you. That a good summer will make you forget how bad the cold can be. That you'll grow used to warmth and lose the edge that kept you alive. So you stay sharp. You don't let your hands idle for long. You don't sleep too deep. You keep your eyes on the sky and your ear to the ground. This is how you live now, in this uneasy balance between gratitude and vigilance. You're thankful for the sun, but you know better than to trust it. You enjoy the harvest festival, but you save your best apples just in case. You dance by the fire, but you keep your boots near the door. There's a saying in the village, one that gets passed down like an heirloom: enjoy the green, but remember the white. It's a reminder, a mantra, a quiet agreement between survivors. It means don't waste, don't forget, don't get too comfortable, because the snow will come again. And when it does, it won't care how hard you danced last June. So you teach your children gently but firmly, not to fear but to know, how to check traps, how to seal a window, how to tell if the cold is coming early. You don't scare them. You don't need to. They've heard the stories. They've seen the scars. Some still remember the winter coughs and the way everyone's voice was just a little quieter when the snow piled against the door. But you also teach them to live, to laugh, to savor. Because if winter taught you anything, it's that surviving isn't the same as living. And if you're given the rare grace of a good summer, you don't waste it being afraid. You use it. You love harder. You rest deeper. You hold someone close and let yourself believe, just for a moment, that maybe this year will be different. The church keeps its sermons steady. The priest still talks of sin and salvation, but even he seems gentler in the sun. Maybe he, too, remembers. Maybe he, too, flinched at the wind in February and whispered to saints with frozen fingers. Or maybe he's just glad his wine didn't freeze this time. And while the church remains powerful, its grip seems less tight in summer. Fear wanes with the frost. People talk a little freer. Joke a little bolder. Some even skip mass, just once or twice, to tend to their gardens or take their children swimming in the river. The priest frowns, but not as deeply. He knows the cold will bring them back. And the forest, once a place of shadows and whispers, feels less cruel now. You walk its edge for mushrooms or firewood and don't rush as much. You hear birds, not howls. And when a twig snaps, your heart still jumps, but not as high. You still carry a blade, of course. You still check your backtrail. But there's less dread in your steps. More curiosity. You begin to remember that the world isn't only survival. That it can be beautiful even if it's brutal. The way the river reflects the sky like it's trying to hold on to the blue. The way wheat moves in the wind like a sea. The way a child's laugh can make even the hardest man pause. But you also know, this is borrowed time. The sun will fade. The fields will brown. The wind will shift. And once again you'll pack your stores. You'll gather herbs and salt meat and seal cracks in the walls. You'll count everything twice. Because the peace of summer doesn't erase the price of winter. It just pays interest on it. You don't mourn that truth. You just accept it. Because in the Middle Ages, acceptance isn't weakness. It's wisdom. You don't waste energy fighting the cycle. You learn to move with it. You bend like the trees, sway like the crops, dig deep like the roots. And when someone asks, will this winter be better? You don't answer. Not really. You just nod and say, we'll be ready. Because that's all anyone can promise. Not comfort. Not safety. Just readiness. You don't think of yourself as a hero. No one does. There are no songs written about the peasant who kept her children fed with broth scraped from a bone, or the man who lost 2 fingers to frostbite and still repaired the village fence. There are no paintings of the woman who buried her neighbor's child because the father was too weak to stand. No ballads for the quiet kind of bravery, the staying kind, the enduring kind. You exist in the margins of history. You live between wars, between kings, between crusades. You're the backdrop to someone else's story. The part no one writes down. But that doesn't mean you don't matter. You've seen things the nobles haven't. You've survived things no priest has preached about. You've stared hunger in the eye and buried people whose names won't be remembered. And still you wake up every day to do it again. You patch roofs. You shear sheep. You pull splinters from your palms and don't complain. Your victories are small and silent. A loaf that rose. A cough that passed. A winter that didn't take someone this time. You don't measure success in gold or fame, you measure it in survival. In making it to spring. In planting the seed and watching it grow. In hearing your child laugh one more time. But still it stings, being forgotten. You walk past the manor and see tapestries of saints and knights. You kneel in the church beneath stained glass windows paid for by taxes taken from your crop. And you wonder, what will they say about you when you're gone? Will they even say anything? Because you've given everything to this life. Your strength, your breath, your best years. And in the end, your grave will be unmarked. Your name will fade with the wood of the cross above it. No one will write your story. And yet, somehow that doesn't stop you. You still work the soil with hands rougher than tree bark. You still patch your neighbor's roof even when yours needs fixing. You still share your last egg because you remember what it was like to have none. You still hum songs no one else remembers, pass on recipes that aren't written down, teach your children how to find wild garlic and avoid sour berries. You still live with a kind of quiet grace, the kind that isn't rewarded, only repeated. You see, that's the thing about survival. It isn't loud. It doesn't scream. It doesn't demand attention. It just continues. One foot in front of the other. One season into the next. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the miracle isn't being remembered. Maybe it's that you were here at all. That you endured when so many didn't. That you built something, however small, in the face of something enormous. That your life, your hard, humble, painful life, was still yours. Fully lived. Fully felt. Not easy. Not glorious. But real. And maybe, just maybe, that's the legacy that matters. Not the songs, not the scrolls, but the fields you turned with your hands. The bread you baked with your last bit of flour. The child who learned to laugh again because you stayed. You don't expect to be remembered, but you do expect to matter. Because even the smallest fire keeps away the dark. Even the faintest breath proves you're still here. You get up. You tie your boots. You step into the morning light. And you live. Because in a world where nothing is guaranteed, not warmth, not food, not memory, your survival is enough. And for those who come after, even if they don't know your name, they will walk the paths you cleared, sleep in homes you patched, harvest from fields you once planted. That too is legacy. That too is worth everything. There's something strange about the quiet after survival. The way the world feels still, as if holding its breath, watching to see if you'll stand again. And you do. Because what choice do you have? You've survived another winter. Another season that tried to claim your breath. You've counted your dead, patched your roof, buried the past beneath seedlings and silence. But in your heart, you know, it's not over. It's never over. The next winter is already waiting. You can feel it in the breeze, still sharp even beneath the sun. You catch it in the caution behind people's eyes, the way they still glance toward the sky, still hoard the last of the salt. Survival taught you this. Winter doesn't announce itself with snow. It arrives first in memory, in the ache of old frostbite, in the fear of an empty cellar, in the silence between storms. You become a kind of prophet. Not the holy kind. The peasant kind. You can tell when someone's lying about how much food they have left. You can hear the tension in a cough. You can smell sickness before it's named. And still you do what you've always done. You prepare. You rebuild. You reseal the windows with more straw, even though they'll never be truly warm. You mend the coats even though the thread is weak. You collect firewood with a quiet urgency, knowing what scarcity feels like in your bones. The rhythm of life never really changes, just adapts. You live by the sky and soil, not the calendar. Seasons are not months, they're moods. Winter isn't December. It's hunger. Spring isn't April. It's survival. But even in all of this, you find something close to meaning. Not joy, maybe, but understanding. You understand your neighbor now, the one who seemed gruff, distant, angry. You saw him give his last potato to a crying child and say nothing. You understand the woman who stopped smiling after her daughter died. You've heard her singing again, quietly, while kneading dough. That's what healing looks like here. Not sudden or whole, just gradual. Grimy hands washing in cold water, a half-hummed hymn, someone bringing over a crust of bread without asking why. That's community. Not warmth, but shared cold. Not plenty, but shared lack. No one here has much. But everyone here gives something. You learn that stories don't need parchment. They live in habits, in tools passed down, in lullabies whispered to restless children. You tell tales not to entertain, but to remember. About the worst winter in living memory. About the time the wolves came close. About the man who went missing and the bread that lasted longer than it should have. And slowly spring softens you. The green returns. Life presses its thumbprint into the dirt. You feel it in your spine. Not peace. Not safety. But possibility. The hardest thing isn't surviving winter. It's believing spring will come again. But it does. Somehow it always does. You see it in the faces of children born after the worst year. They don't carry the same weight. They run barefoot through mud. They throw stones at crows. They laugh too loud. And for a moment you don't silence them. You let it ring out. Because that laughter is defiance. It's proof that something lived after everything tried to die. And that matters. You'll teach them what you can. How to dry roots properly. How to tell good wood from wet. How to fake a smile for the priest when your knees ache too much to kneel. You'll show them how to survive, not by fighting, but by enduring. By knowing when to speak and when to stay still. When to give and when to guard. And one day they'll tell your stories. Not with names, maybe, but with meaning. My grandmother always said this stew tastes best after a fast. My father never trusted the first warm day in March. My mother used to sing this tune when she stirred the pot. That's what remembrance looks like here. No statues. No scrolls. Just survival etched into routine. And when your time finally comes, and it will, you hope it's spring. Not winter. You hope there's sunlight on the roof, bread on the shelf, and someone nearby who remembers the right prayers. Not because they guarantee anything but because they help. You want your passing to feel like a season changing, not a flame being snuffed. You want someone to plant something after. A tree. A herb. A seed. You want the silence you leave behind to be full of meaning. Because in a world where the cold always comes again, legacy isn't measured by how loudly you lived, but by how long your warmth lingered after you were gone. So you live. You breathe. You carry firewood with hands that still tremble from old frost. You plant. You repair. You wait. Not for praise. Not for peace. But for the next season. Because life doesn't stop. And neither do you. Not yet. Maybe not ever. End of script.